Tired of transcription headaches? Trent's automated transcription software can convert video, audio, and speech to text in more than 40 languages with up to 99% accuracy. Tell your stories faster by transcribing, translating, editing, and collaborating in a single workflow. We use Trent for this podcast, and it really does make a difference. Honestly, if you don't want your transcripts to be used for training algorithms, Trent really is the place to be. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Operations Room, a podcast for COOs. I am Brandon Mensinga, joined by my lovely co-host Bethany Ayers. How are things going, Bethany?
You know how December is really hard and you have to do so much work and you have all of the parties, but everybody's like, but don't worry, it'll all be over. And then you can breathe out in January. And then if you run the fiscal year or even 1 month off, that's a lie because January is twice as hard as December.
Is that true?
I think it is, or at least that's where I am. There's such incredibly intense months, and then there's January. And also just the way that we're running it this year, so I'm just back from 4 days in Manchester. The Tuesday was our monthly go-to-market meeting and kind of quarterly planning session. Oh, I don't know if I've mentioned this, but so I'm also running the account management team as maternity cover for the next 9 months. Yeah, you
briefly mentioned this. Yes. Right. All things to all people. That's Bethany.
That's me. Isn't that the COO thing? All the different roles that you could, the Swiss Army knife of talent that means that you can be slotted into anything on top of your other jobs.
I guess what's exciting about that is that you're hitting all the levels of the business, right? It's like functional, practical, all the way through the strategic.
Yeah. But then next week, I'm luckily at home, but next week is planning for peak kickoff, sales kickoff, pro serve kickoff, all the content production next week. And then the following week back in Manchester for all of those kickoffs, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, get home Thursday night, fly to Jaipur Friday morning. And then I'm in Jaipur for a week doing kickoff. So that includes engineering and product kickoff.
So that is a tremendous amount of planning and kind of kicking things off for 2025. So, and usually as a CEO, you're so intimately involved in all these kickoffs.
I'm looking forward to February. February is when I can breathe out. But it was an interesting QBR and strategy session that I thought would be worth talking about. I was responsible for running the QBR and the exec offsite strategy session. And I was really stressed going into it because I felt underprepared and I didn't know what kind of format would work and I didn't know how they were going to go. So the QBR, just for a bit of background, is a reboot with the wider teams. We've been doing QBRs just as an exec team and that's been working well. And this is the first time we've added the next layer, like their direct reports in. And then this is my first exec offsite to run. And first of all, I realized that I much prefer spontaneity than structure. Surprise, surprise. I don't know if this is the first time we've realized this about me.
I think it's been the consistent revelation over the course of the podcast.
But I guess it's just if you think about a COO, they're all about structure and process and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like the antithesis of that kind of COO, despite being the Swiss Army knife of able to do whatever role I need to do. So we had broad agenda items, but way more relaxed and had a huge amount of preparation. So for the strategy day, we probably had 150, 200 slides / pages to read over a week, questions to think about, context. But if you think about it, it's, across all of the different departments. That's not actually that many slides per department, but everybody having the context of the goals, the challenges, the must-dos, what's going well, what's not going well in each of the departments, and the interconnects, we were able to go in and be very much less structured. And we kind of started with problem number one and then let it just be an open conversation. And it was probably one of the most effective conversations we've ever had some amazing insights come out of it. And it also naturally concluded at about an hour 45. And we're like, this is resolved. We're done. Then we knew what our next topic was, took quite a big break because we had to do some other stuff and regrouped with everybody having that time to think. And then the next topic was covered in that same kind of time frame, naturally concluded. And we did our final one. And the final one was OKRs. And because it wasn't like such a totally exhausting day, we were able to have much better conversations around the OKRs and like properly, rather than it being the rush at the end, people's brains were still active. And so I was trying to reflect on what made it work well. And I think it was actually the fact that we're a highly functioning and performant team at the moment. That means that I don't think the structure matters. I think whatever structure it was would have worked. And also a lot of it was around how do we work better? How do we solve the problems together? How does everybody contribute to the overarching functioning of the company rather than siloed? And that was it felt really good. I guess I found that the really highly structured ones don't work. So it was a bit of a gamble. So now, of course, I'm like, how do I do it again? When we get to the quarterly versions of all of this.
Why do you think the team was in a good place, do you think, to have high quality conversations?
Because I'm an amazing leader. Part of it, I think, is because of this, like the operating model or the cadence that I've spoken about, where we're seeing each other twice a week. We're able to bond and build trust through that regular contact, surfacing issues. So not letting things slide. It's like, I do a lot of face reading. And so when I see somebody whose face is like the microsecond of a grimace or an eye roll, I don't let it pass. And I don't say, you've just rolled your eyes, because that's, but I'll just say, oh, it looks like you have an issue with that. What are you thinking? And then we let it come out until there are like no grimaces or eye rolls and things have surfaced. So that is working. Encouraging more communication between teams, or like, you two are clearly not speaking enough. If these are surprises that are coming out in the meeting, figure out how you're going to communicate together. So there's a lot more interconnect one-on-ones between team members when it becomes obvious that people are not talking the way they should. And then having a bit of a laugh, like being okay with some joking, a little bit of that, the levity of it. And actually something I've done in the last 2 days, and I don't know, I have to ask people if it's coming across genuine or not. Like for me, it is genuine, is not finishing on a high, but like reflecting on, these have been some conversations that are difficult. This person might be feeling like they're being quite beaten up, but the fact that they're being beaten up is because of how far we've progressed, that we're even able to have that conversation versus where we were before. Let's take a moment to reflect on how much we've achieved and therefore what's going forward. And also like calling out good things that have happened and recognizing those good things in the meeting. So it's like reinforcing the good behaviors or the good ideas or the good connections between us.
We have got a great topic for today, which is how do you implement the first team concept? We have an amazing guest for this, which is Cassie Young. She's the general partner at Primary Venture Partners and a seasoned CRO/Chief Customer Officer. So maybe first off, your definition of first team.
The most senior team that you are a part of is your first team. And so as an exec, it's the exec team. But for your direct reports, it's that team, like that functional team. And what that means is that you put your first team ahead of your other teams. So it's, if you're on the exec, how do you solve the business's problems and have your team as your department or your function as resource to solve the company's problems, rather than viewing it as you're going into exec team meetings to represent your team.
So first team really is prioritizing your peer level team. And in this case for us, that's the leadership or executive team. And the reason why, as opposed to your direct reports, and the reason why that's useful is for that collective leadership team to come together to solve the company's problems fundamentally. working together to make that happen, as opposed to representing your functional unit. So I guess some of the challenges in making this come alive for companies, the first one is conflicting loyalty, which is they're loyal to their direct reports. They're loyal to their function. That's how they've grown up in terms of their lineage within marketing or sales or whatever. And now they're being presented with this idea that they should be treating and prioritizing their peer level team, the leadership team, as their number one priority as opposed to their function now. And they have that kind of conflicting feeling of loyalty. So what do you do with that?
I think it's around how you mature as a leader. And it's actually something that you need to learn to progress to the next level. So, as individual contributor, the first step is being directed by somebody else. The second step is directing yourself. Then you have the ability as a manager to direct a team. And then as a senior manager director, it's directing multiple teams. Then you get to the VP level. It's not just running a function, it's looking across the teams. And so representing your team, but in the context of the rest of the organization. So not having a victim mentality, rather than just saying, well, marketing gives us shit leads, you work with marketing to get the leads that you want. And that's a real mind shift change. So but that's, I think, still representing your team, but not being a victim and being proactive. And then when you move to the exec, it's understanding that now that your team is the company, how does your team help the company rather than how does the company help your team?
So the other one of interest here was resistance to vulnerability, because what you need in that leadership team is for people to trust each other to be able to bring forward challenges and problems in a very honest, authentic way to allow the group to help each other figure out what the best thing to do is. And the worst thing in the world is to have your marketing leader to come in and to obfuscate and to not share what is happening in terms of something that may not be good. And they feel somehow that they can't trust the others in the group to share it and to feel like they may be viewed in a certain way, I suppose. And I guess the question is, how do you create that trust and allow that vulnerability to occur where I'm sharing something within my function that is not good, but I need help. And I'm happy to share that to the group and actually get the group to help me think it through.
So in the past, I would have thought about it as vulnerability of there's a problem in my area I need help with, and then have the confidence to feel like, okay, I'm not going to lose my job because of it. But often the things that are going to cause you to lose your job are your problems. You've hired the wrong VP of growth and you're not delivering well and there are people issues and actually nobody else can solve that problem because it is something in your own area. And in the first team, it should be, how do you broach the topic of, it's not that your VP of growth is failing, it's that the product has fallen behind the rest, or the way the sales team is acting and selling is so against the brand, your brand has now been rubbished in the market. And it's not how are you vulnerable around your area, but how do you raise topics that are impacting your team because of other areas? And how do you have that rather than pushing the product person under the bus? How do you frame it in a way that is a problem that everybody needs to solve?
It kind of works both ways, doesn't it? There's your functional issues that are happening, but there's also things that you're seeing within other functions that you're very concerned about.
Yeah. And then it comes down to, how do you broach it in a way that doesn't freak everybody out and get super defensive so that you can have a good conversation around it, talk about resource allocation, talk about plans, talk about what the other departments can do to help the one who's struggling.
And I think, to be honest, Bethany, I feel like this topic is probably the single most difficult thing in any business is to have this happen. You know what I mean? I've seen this over and over again where I've tried all sorts of things over time to put the group in a position where we can have these conversations in a healthy, constructive way. But it is very difficult. People fundamentally are very loath to point out other people's potential issues, any things that you would think about as to how to facilitate this or to make this better over time.
So I think part of it, at least for me, is I'm often the one pointing it out in my current role because I can see and I'm looking holistically. One of the things that I'm using to do this is the SaaS flywheel, where have you seen this, where it's a line in a circle I talked about it actually around metrics for on the business event, but I use it a lot for basically like that customer journey. So it's leads, opportunities, customers is the straight line. And then the flywheel is where the customers, you onboard the customers. They're so happy that they buy more, renew, buy more. I'm never quite sure which order makes more sense. And then you onboard them, they're happy and they keep spending. And that's the SaaS flywheel where the land and expand happens, or they don't expand, but they're big enough at a point that you retain them. And looking through that customer journey and seeing the pain points, and like, you know, the pain point might be in support and the number of bugs that they're dealing with, but then you can follow that journey through and see what is causing the issue. So looking at it systemically, and it's not, rarely is it one person's mistake or issue. It tends to be death by 1,000 cuts. And so you look at like, what are all the things that are contributing to that? And therefore, what can we all do to make it better?
Yeah, I like that. So it's more of the systemic view across the organization. And to your point, a lot of issues are cross-functional in nature in some form. It's not usually strictly a sales problem or a marketing problem or a product problem. It's usually, as you said, across a broader spectrum, and kind of walking that logic through, I guess. And also perhaps the data nuggets behind that allows it to be less people and function focused and more of a collective problem for the group, I suppose. And I guess the other part is the modeling, because if you're pointing it out as an example, you're modeling the ability for others to do the same in a constructive, useful fashion, which is we are having issues. And if you're happy to point things out, then perhaps that's going to have a knock-on effect for the others in the group to feel comfortable to do the same thing. And I guess the other point is you being in a position where you're rewarding that behavior either in the meeting or after the meeting in terms of making people feel like they've done the right thing by having that discussion, doing it in a very constructive way. And then equally, if people are not doing that, then making sure that you're having conversations around that too. I suspect one-to-one in that case to encourage that.
And then also just wanted to point out one thing in what you were saying around it's not around specific people. That's actually one of the lessons from the Gino Wickman book, EOS, Entrepreneurial Operating System. Like, I think my biggest takeaway from that book is that all problems are people problems. You know, like genuinely, like rather than trying to scaffold something around somebody who's incapable of doing their job, being able to have that conversation. And so even if you're looking at the entire flywheel, you may notice that we have a skills gap, we have an experience gap, we have somebody who, you know, it might be that actually that VP of growth who's not delivering leads, if marketing realized it, they would just change their VP of growth. But if somebody else is realizing it and pointing it out, then you have a conversation around, are we being unfair, blah, blah. And like the solution may be that you replace a VP of growth, but that's a team conversation rather than like the marketing person having to be all by themselves, realizing that somebody's underperforming, but they've just hired them and it took them 18 months. They don't want to fire them. It's like, no, you have to fire them.
No, that's a great point, actually, because like the skill gap or capability gap, if something's happening, and being in a position to include that as part of the conversation makes obvious sense as well. I guess the other one that I was thinking about that you pointed out some time back, and this is a slightly broader trust building kind of activity, I guess, which is something in the business that truly speaking pulls a leadership team together to focus on something that really, really matters and to have that shared experience, that galvanizing experience where we're all in this together. We got to make this happen. It's a bit extraordinary, but let's do it and let's make it happen. And having that shared experience where you're working very closely side by side with the leadership team can really make a difference, a breakthrough difference in terms of the trust that you've actually built within that leadership team. Well, I think your example that you gave was fundraising, because fundraising is a kind of a bit of a battle cry to the business, and in particular, the leadership team to pull themselves together to get the right metrics and getting on the road to talk to VCs around, you know, the business and why it's tremendously exciting and so on. What do you make of that?
I do agree. Like, so often people view fundraising as a burden and a distraction, but instead you should view it as an opportunity to both build together as a team and grow as a team, but also get all of the strategy questions out of the way and like really properly think about your next 3 to 5 years when you're doing it.
So, love it. Let's park it here. Let's move on to our conversation with Miss Cassie Young. We are revving up the engine of the podcast and looking for a great brand to sponsor the show. We have over 7,000 listeners now across COOs, CEOs, founders, and operational professionals who are decision makers for all kinds of technology, including HR, planning, strategy, legal, and other tools.
It's Beth here. I just wanted to thank you for listening to the podcast, and we'd love to keep it going, but we're going to need to get some sponsors in order to do that. So if you work at a company that could benefit from speaking to listeners like you, or know of a company that might benefit, please send them our way.
To find out more, go to operationsroom.co/sponsorship. That is operationsroom.co/sponsorship.
So the concept of first team, or team number one, as it's sometimes called, was made famous by Patrick Lencioni, who wrote books like Five Dysfunctions of a Team and The Advantage, which are some of my favorite business reads. The central concept of it is that the more senior you become in an organization, the more important it is for you to embrace the reality that your first team is your team of peers, right? So the most senior team that you sit on versus your functional swim lane or your direct reports. So if you are the chief marketing officer of a B2B software company, your first team is most likely that cross-functional leadership team that you sit on with the CFO and the CTO, et cetera, not your head of demand gen or head of brand. And it sounds really obvious when people hear it just said that squarely out, but people don't think about that often in sort of the day-to-day rhythms of their work. And what happens when they don't embrace that is they fall victim to what I call the swim lane trap. And we can talk more about that later. But the one thing I want to harp on with first team is it actually cascades the whole way down in the organization. So the example I give people is if you're the chief customer officer, you probably have this team of lieutenants that report to you, like your head of technical support and your head of the CSM team and your head of professional services. They are your second team, right? For all the reasons we just talked about, but they are each other's first team because that's the most senior team that they sit on. And time again, I find this is a really powerful message for up and coming directors in an organization because it's like the blame game or, one function to the other. And they have to embrace the concept of team number one and first team as well.
My experience is I've looked at it in a slightly different way where maybe I haven't realized I was thinking about it in first team. For me, if you get first team right, then you just don't have the politics, because where the politics come in is my team is my identity, is being a CMO. And so what I care about more than anything is how do I promote my function? And if you have everybody doing that, you get loads of politics. Whereas if you view the success of the company as your job, you don't tend to backstab your colleagues.
That's right. And I think to bring that to life for a moment, I always share this example of a board slide I unfortunately had to witness, right? And I'm going to pick on marketing, but we can pick on some other functions later. The CMO had this slide in the board deck that was celebrating the fact that quarter over quarter, they had doubled the number of closed won deals that were sourced by marketing, right? So they said we went from 45% of closed won deals sourced by marketing to 90%. And this was this huge celebratory point. But what was lost on that particular slide is that this was presented in the context of a board meeting where we discussed how the overall business had shrunk. Okay. So the business is shrinking and the marketing leader is in there celebrating the fact, right, that more of the closed won deals were sourced by marketing. The same ththing happens though, like in product and engineering functions, right? Everyone comes in and celebrates roadmap velocity and all of the features shipped. We had an event in New York recently where, the CTO speaker had this great line where she said, if it can't be sold, it doesn't matter. And so for product and engineering, I'm like, if you don't have the corresponding data and adoption and monetization, right, it's the same trap. But Bethany, your point on politics is also an interesting one because all of those books, right, by Table Group, they have a whole other definition of the world politics, right, where they say politics in the organization is actually when you change your message based on the audience. Right. And I think that actually does apply here as well, too, where there may be one message that you have in your functional lane, right, and one different set of things that you're talking about in the management suite. And so I completely agree with you. It's putting the business above your functional results, but it's also that just consistency of messaging and how you're talking about things. And I incidentally listened to a podcast, but it was with Shane Battier, who's an NBA player here in the States. I'm a huge Duke basketball fan. He's a Duke alum, so I always love to look at Shane Battier leadership advice. But they talked about this concept of playing for the front of the jersey, not the back, which I think was another really interesting way to think about the concept of first team, where you're not playing for your name, right? You're playing for the company. And I think that's just an easy way to explain the concept, particularly down the ranks as well.
The question on the mind of the CEO always is, how do you do this? How do you actually create a first team? So if you have individuals that are functionally coming from that mindset of, I'm the functional owner, I'm responsible for marketing, I care about my metrics and my team, and they're the most important thing to me. And then you start trying to shift their mindset to a different space, i.e. the first team in this case. Can you maybe just walk us through a bit of the practicality of how do you make that happen?
For sure. Well, the first thing I'll say to you is that I believe that teams will never be aligned if their compensation plans are not. And I think that's a very straightforward place to start. And I'll walk you through a very tangible example of this. I was at a software company called Sailthrough, and we went through this journey where the company grew faster than our technology would allow. We hit scaling problems, right? Everything of that fold. We brought in an outside CEO and really had to execute something of a turnaround strategy around customer churn, customer trust, et cetera. What we said was, okay, there are functionally always going to be three things that matter most to us as a company, right? The first is to grow our business naturally. And the metric we're going to choose for how we grow our business is exit ARR, right? Because that's the composite of new logos. It's the composite of what we don't churn, right? What we grow from expansion. So number one was grow the business with exit ARR. Number two was net promoter score, right? Because we said the second bucket of things is be a trusted partner. Now, you could argue the merits of NPS as a metric all day long. We had to focus on that because our NPS score was in the toilet, okay, after these scaling challenges. It was negative 26 to give you a sense of it, right? So we needed attention focus there. And then the third for us was operating predictably and responsibly, right? And for us, that became a net burn target. And then over time, it evolved into an EBITDA target, right? Once the business was cash flow positive. Now, we had in every monthly all hands for years, the same first slide that had those three buckets and those metrics. So everyone was talking about them. The numbers changed from year to year, but the central principles did not. Where this comes into first team and the management team was we changed the executive bonus plans to say every executive has a 30% bonus that is driven by those three numbers. You would not believe the behavioral change you see in a product organization that happens when suddenly the bonus is tied to net promoter score, right? It's tied to exit ARR. It just drives alignment. Now, that is sort of the stick approach of how you go about it. I also think there's a lot of just kind of qualitative changes that you can encourage of the team as well. So for instance, I always say, if you're an executive, you're probably doing one-on-ones with every single one of your functional direct reports every single week. What's your cadence with your peers on the first team, right? I don't think you need to meet with them once a week, but at a minimum, I would expect you to meet with them once a month, right? That you're sitting down and getting aligned. So I do think it's on everybody to give that team the same priority and weight that they would, right? The people who report to them that they're sort of growing and fostering. But I strongly believe that the fastest way to get there is to make sure that the incentives are extremely aligned.
I agree to the extent that whenever I join a company and I'm presented with my bonus, I just is this how everybody else on the leadership team is paid? And if the answer is no, I say, well, no. We're going to have to work on that. I'm not going to join where we're not paid in the same way because it doesn't work otherwise. And you're all pulling in different directions. The other way that I've helped foster this team is to talk about it as it's an element of development. And it's you're almost not ready for the next one if you can't think across the company and you can only think in your swim lane. And that will keep you from actually getting promoted or retaining that top table role. And that for me became very clear when you hear people talk about it's X's fault. Marketing won't do what I need marketing to do. PS won't do what I need PS to do. What can I do? I'm just here in sales. And that is not a top team table mentality. Your job is, how do I fix upstream? How do I fix downstream? We're a connected system. How do we fix this together? And that is how you get promoted and stay promoted.
And I think one of the areas of pushback that I've had historically is that, you have like a functional leader, and I'm suggesting to them around this, first team mindset. This is the attitude that we should have. And their first reaction is, well, that's a whole bunch more activity and meetings that you're asking for that I don't have time for. So when you have that kind of reaction, what I suggested back to that person, this example at least, was kind of what Bethany had said, which is, when you think about your career development, you think about the next step for yourself. The next step literally is you having to work on the business, not in the business. And on the business means A, B, and C. And if you have no experience doing that, it's going to make it that much more difficult for you to make that jump and to be successful when you make that jump. So we had this back and forth, and eventually we came to the right place. But this question of pushback around a whole bigger swath of meetings, what do you do with that?
So maybe a two-part answer. I think I agree with everything you two said, right? Around like fundamentally the job changes when you're an executive. And someone said to me many years ago that the more senior you become in an organization, the more all roles converge. And your job is just people management and running the business, right? And you might do it over product and ends, you might do it over sales and CS, but the jobs are all the same. And that really resonated with me. And one message I'll often say to up and comers is like, you have to choose if that's the path for you, right? I think a lot of times people, they falsely conflate people management with leadership, right? Like the only way I can be a leader in this organization is if I have like a bigger team and I run the function. And that's actually not the job for everybody, right? There are many other ways to be standout leaders in an organization and to contribute. And I think naming that for people is super important and being very real about what the job is as you climb through the ranks, right? Like everything is a people problem when you're running a large organization. Like that's your job. That's what you're doing all day long. That said, Brandon, to your point, I do think you have to be very disciplined in terms of meeting hygiene, right? Challenging norms. I feel like as I've been part of growing companies in the past, like we've just had to commit ourselves to iterating and to challenging the status quo, right? Every couple months on what we were doing. So to give you an example from a past life, like we had a very tight quarterly business review process by every function. And it just became like the preparation for the quarterly business reviews just became totally daunting and probably not the best use of time. And we said, why don't we switch into more of kind of an Amazonian memo format, right? To put that together, give a pre-read. So I think there are ways that you can kind of shortcut or short circuit some of the, meeting fatigue and prep, et cetera. And that every organization just has to be very disciplined about saying, oh, like, is this an energy drain? And if so, what small adjustments could we make to make that, more accommodating or appealing to the participants?
So this is a challenge that I've recognized recently. I'm trying to get people to communicate with more empathy to their listeners. And what I don't mean is being kind or how are people going to feel, but what do people need to know to do their jobs better, rather than sharing with people what I've been doing to justify why I have a job.
I think that's very well said.
It's really hard to make that transition. It is something like every meeting, I'm just like, how do we get people to think about the information? And it's amazing because we share so much information that nobody consumes it. And then I go to a meeting and say something and half the room have no idea of like the one most important thing because it's hidden in all of the justification of jobs. Have you figured out ways to make this happen?
I think it's really hard to your point, but one framing that I frequently think about, many years ago, someone used this acronym and I was like, what's this acronym? And the acronym was WIFM, or the what's in it for me. I share that acronym now because I do think as you're working with different audiences, you have to approach it from the frame of what's in it for them, right? Like they are thinking about it that way. So to your point, it's not that you're coming to say, hey, I need you to go do a ton of customer case studies, right? Because we don't have any. It's, hey, your goal as the marketing team, right, is aligned to, ultimately the number of influence closed won deals. More of these case studies are going to help us get it done. Time and time again, we get that ask, right? But it's really making it real for them based on their success metrics, which is why I think it becomes easier if everyone has the same success metrics, right? So that you don't have to politic that message in different places, but you have to preempt the question and sort of seed the so what for people when you're talking with them or making that ask of them. I also just think there's a huge win to be had with just positive reinforcement when things work, right? So I think it's like very frequent, you talk about customer feedback or problems or requests. But, oftentimes like customer wins are just thrown into a Slack channel and never really talked about. Like bringing a customer into regular all hands meetings, right? Giving the engineering team, one approach that worked really well for me in the past was to bring in the technical stakeholder from different customers and have them sit down with the sprint teams who built the product that they implemented. Because the engineers, like I was selling to CMOs, they didn't necessarily really want to listen to what the CMO economic buyer had to say, but they loved getting the technical feedback, right? On the API flexibility. So I think it's meeting kind of your internal stakeholders where they are, right? With positive reinforcement aligned to the goals, can be a strong path as well.
When it comes to kind of cadences and the number of hours that you spend with your first team, can you give us a bit of a flavoring around that in terms of on a weekly basis, monthly basis, quarterly basis? Like what is a good mixture of things, do you think?
Yeah. So, and I'm not going to claim to take credit for this. I actually think a lot of my own learning on this came directly out of frameworks like those that are presented in The Advantage and elsewhere, right? But the general approach that I've seen work really well is, you have your weekly leadership team meeting, right? Which is usually probably minimum an hour and a half, right? In kind of growing and scaling companies. I really like this idea of once a quarter for a day, you're taking that first team off site somewhere, right? To wrestle some larger business plan discussion, right? Or talk about what the operating plan for the back half of the year is going to look like, et cetera. But I also like this idea of holding time once a month for ad hoc strategic topics that come up that can't wait until the next quarterly offsite. The trick with that, going back to your previous question, Brandon, about meeting fatigue, is if you don't need the meeting, just cancel it, right? Which I think people are often afraid to do, but you hold the space so it isn't like this crazy fire drill at the last minute to find 90 minutes and everyone's annoyed because you're disrupting, their weekly workflow. So I like the dedicated weekly meeting. And I want to come back to that because I think the format and what's done there is really, really important. This holding space once a month for an hour, hour and a half for a deeper dive topic, and then the quarterly day together offsite, and maybe once a year that's even longer, right, than the one day. You're doing that for a longer period of time. Now, that's the full team together. As I said earlier, there's also these monthly cadences around the table, right? So if I'm the CRO, I'm probably going to have another, 5 or so meetings, right, with the other kind of key C's around the table just to make sure we're sort of building that rapport, et cetera. And that monthly meeting is a good stopgap. But I also think it's great executives go way above and beyond that. The quick comment I'll make just on the weekly cadence is I think a lot of times those meetings can just be highly dysfunctional, right? Where it's sort of a free-for-all, what the agenda is. I do think there are some best practices that companies can follow around, okay, we always start with the numbers, right? Number one, because we're working on the business, right? At the end of the day, it's amazing to me that I sometimes shadow leadership team meetings and I'm like, where are the numbers in this meeting, right? We're not just here to talk about how we're feeling or what the weather, is looking like. So that's number one. Number two is the CEO is the boss, right? So how do you let the CEO set the agenda for any given week? So in the past, I've liked these approaches where, the senior executives can propose topics, but ultimately the CEO curates the agenda from week to week around the places where, they do or don't want to dig in.
I love that talk about the CEO being the boss and the agenda, because then also you're the boss of your functional lead and you're doing the same. And that was one of the things that happened when I first became COO and had basically all of the customer functions. So it was marketing, sales, data science, customer success. So we had quite a few. And then my job became basically an events organizer. I felt am I getting paid really a lot of money to organize meetings? But that is actually a large part of your job, is to think about how to have good meetings and how to have meetings where people can talk and how you can get to the issues. And it was just such a weird moment for me.
And I also think it's that, and it's what's happening in those meetings is how you communicate, right? And how you drive clarity for people.
Yeah, because when you think about it, you've got the 6 or 7 most expensive people in the company meeting on a weekly basis. And if that meeting is a shit show, you're kind of wasting that money, number one. And then number two, the amplification of what comes out of that meeting, if it's been a terrible meeting and it's divisive or whatever, the impact on the rest of the company as a ripple effect is also potentially quite negative as well.
I completely agree. And I think to that point, Brandon, like it is worthwhile at the end of executive meetings, particularly like the meatier monthly meetings or the quarterlies, but you can certainly do it week to week, is aligning on what you are or are not going to cascade. Like what is off limits? And if it's not off limits, then you should feel empowered, right, to go into your functional lane and cascade those communications. I think it's ridiculously important when you're going off site, because invariably when you take 7 really expensive senior leaders of the company off site, you know what's happening on the ground, right? Everyone's like, what's going on? What are they talking about? Is there going to be a layoff? Is there going to be this? So I do think being as open as possible with that is great. And you can really prioritize doing that week to week.
We do that because I've noticed that there's an inconsistency of ability to communicate, or an inconsistency of what is communicated. And so I introduced that. But I'm not sure we still always take the time. Like sometimes you have meetings, because we meet twice a week. Like it's set for an hour. Sometimes it's a full hour. But like, as you said, sometimes it's 15 minutes because all we have is 15 minutes worth of stuff, but we have the 2. And sometimes it's really clear that we need to talk about what we cascade. And other times it's like, we just talked about random shit. Like, do we need to cascade this or not? And at first it was like, oh no, there's nothing to cascade. And so I realized, no, that's not the point. It's not what should we, it's what shouldn't we? And so it's like, we just talked about random things. All of that is fine to share if you think it's relevant for your team. It's much more important to identify the things that you actively shouldn't share. And then that frees up people to share more. Because I think the default is with fear, they share less.
I think related to that, and your point about there's just such varying degrees of comfort with how people communicate, I think leaders almost have to force themselves into accountability. So I mentioned earlier, when I was on the operating side, I sent this note every Monday night for years and years and years. And like, I couldn't not do that note. So it just held me accountable. And I wrote the note over the course of the week, right? I'd be like, okay, what do I want to include? I came out of the leadership, meeting today. What am I going to put it from that in terms of takeaways in this note versus what am I not? My functional leaders knew they could send me stuff that they wanted in there, but it was just this forcing function for making sure I was communicating. So it doesn't have to be once a week. It could be, hey, like I'm going to have a monthly engineering all hands. And these are the things I'm always going to commit to talking about in that all hands meeting, right? You just find what works for you. But I think you have to have some degree of accountability in like what the mechanism is for how and when you share.
What do you do in the case of the functional leader that is obfuscating?
Yeah, I mean, I think that really healthy teams have healthy conflict, and it starts with the CEO, do you know what I mean, in terms of making people comfortable, challenging each other very directly. And so I think what becomes hard is if you're in one of those meetings where silently everybody knows there's sort of an elephant in the room and what's going on, and the CEO isn't willing to directly challenge, no one around the table is going to do it, right? It's all like the classic norming of the team. And this is why my earlier point about building trust, right? And kind of going out of your way to do that. Conflict is so much easier, right? When you have that trust in the first place, because you can assume positive intent versus if you don't have that, right? Everything kind of goes haywire. And so I do think it's how do you get into the company rhythms of just naming it in the meeting? Going back to that earlier definition that I shared around politics, right? Of saying different things to different audiences. This is where that shows up. It's like we can't talk about it in a group format, but then I'm going to go back and have a sidebar conversation with my CTO about the CMO. Oh my gosh, like what the hell are they doing all day long? And there's a polite and constructive way to do it and frame it right in the meeting. But I do think really strong companies kind of have that public display of challenge, questioning, et cetera, but it's in the name of doing what's best for the business.
I just thought it'd be interesting to change topic a little bit back to the first team. And are there universal skills that make for a great executive that we could almost just then lift as a leadership framework that we use when evaluating ourselves and our other leaders?
Absolutely. So one is like, as we've just talked about ad nauseum, like embracing this leadership mentality, right? Where you do put your team number one first. But the second is just strong P&L command and fluency. And I think this is unfortunately very often lacking in senior executives. And so what do I mean by that? If you're a chief customer officer, you need to be well-versed in like the margin drivers of the business, right? Because so much of what you're doing is servicing the customers, right? And you really have to understand what falls above the line, below the line, and how you help advance the ball on that. And I think a lot of leaders have a hard time connecting their day-to-day work to the top and bottom lines of the company. So I think that's a good place to start. And, people frequently say to me, well, how do I go about doing that? I didn't go to business school. I didn't do X, Y, or Z. My number one suggestion to them is take your CFO to lunch. This is like a branded campaign I think I want to launch in 2025. And when I say CFO, it could be the, VP of FP&A. Take someone in the finance function to lunch. Because let's be honest, no one's inviting our finance colleagues to lunch, right? They're at the bottom of the invite list. Sitting down and saying, hey, could you walk me top to bottom through our company's P&L and the things that you're thinking about in advance of the next board meeting? The finance leaders love it when functional people come and ask them that question. So I think that's a really easy hack. So I think first team, P&L fluency. I think the two other things that I'll highlight, one is just a command for what's going on in the market. And so this is going to sound crazy, but I frequently say to people like, do you read the news? Right? Do you have a point of view on what's going on, right? Particularly in this era of AI, right? You have to have a perspective and you don't need to read that much news. But, I always say like right now, I invest in software companies. Many of them are AI native companies at this point. There's a lot of industry chatter around, is everybody just experimenting with AI software and going to churn off of it? So if I'm talking to a CS leader, I want them to come in with a point of view on what's going on in the market, right? And how they're thinking about that. And the final thing I'll mention, and this, Bethany, going back to where you and I met, I do think is more acute with women than men, is just having a strategic network and making the space for that outside of your company. You may not want to copy verbatim what another business is doing, but every time I talk to leaders at other companies, they say something that just get my gears turning a little bit differently, right? And I think this is particularly important in the era of remote work. I understand remote work can work really well for various companies, but if you're not going to be in an office every day, you have to work that much harder, right? At how am I going to cultivate the strategic network if I'm not hosting people at the office, if I'm not meeting with clients in person regularly? So I just think people have to be deliberate about it. But that's probably at risk of gross oversimplification. But I think if you do those four things really, really well, right, in addition to the brass tack stuff we talked about around like communicating, et cetera, which I think comes back, I think that's a recipe for success. But I would put that communication stuff in that first team bucket as kind of, just being part and parcel with it.
So speaking of seeing things in the news, did you see the video from the NVIDIA CEO, how he has 60 direct reports and no one-to-ones? I would just love to hear your thoughts on that.
That was a talk of our office, right, when we saw that. And you probably also saw that was right around the time of the whole founder mode article that came out. And I thought the founder mode piece, the interesting challenge that was put out there is, our founders just going to use this as a convenient excuse to like do whatever they want? And I think my take is 100%. We had a line when I was on the operating side where we sometimes called things founderitis, right? When they were just kind of happening in the business. But don't mishear me. I think founders are incredible, right? And they really breakout category defining companies are who they are because of like that founder DNA, right? Of what those founders do. I think that is probably for not aligned with my personal approach of how that goes about. Clearly, they're doing something right and it's working well for them. I just read a statistic on the number of NVIDIA employees who are millionaires at this point, and it's absolutely insane in terms of the enterprise value that they've built. But I do think that is probably like an outlier exception case. And it gets dangerous, right, when we're out in the news talking about these amazingly highly performing companies and how they do work, because the vast majority of companies can't operate that way, right? So I think you have to have the creative license as a founder and a CEO of what is going to work best for your company. But as you are getting started on that journey, I don't think you need to recreate the wheel. I think there are some tried and true best practices that you can throw up in flames, right, if they're not working for you. But I think orienting, my fear is people see these crazy one-off outliers. And they're like, well, I'm going to go do it that way. But fundamentally, that's like a 1 in a million company, right?
Just getting back to your P&L fluency comment. What's interesting? I was just thinking about this in my head as you were speaking, but when I join companies as the COO, I have like a real interest in P&L fluency and being able to partner with the finance leader to ensure that we have forecast models that make sense and so on. And I end up spending a disproportionate amount of my time with that finance leader to really understand the models at a certain level of detail and to be able to communicate that effectively to investors or for fundraising or for the company or for the other leaders or whatever. So I end up playing this weird proxy role of like filling that gap or filling that hole in a way where the finance leader can't quite do it. So I step in as the communicator, but I have more of the understanding of the business in totality as opposed to the finance leader. So I end up being that person to represent, I guess, in some sense. But I also feel like maybe it's a bit of like what you said, Bethany, which is I'm filling a hole. And legitimately, the other functional leaders that are actually running their functions at the company should have my knowledge as opposed to Brandon being the proxy.
So for our portfolio companies at Primary, I interview a lot of like very late stage sales, marketing, customer success candidates. And time again, I am shocked that these people who are in VP level roles cannot clearly articulate to me, do you know what I mean? This is exactly what the ARR journey looked like, or this is exactly what the margin journey looked like. And so I think to your point, sometimes you're forced into it when you're in the executive leadership team because you're in the board meetings and you're in the QBRs and you have no choice. Like if you are listening, you have to learn some of this by absorption. But the next level down, I think, is really acutely at risk sometimes and needs, if they're going to think about C-suite readiness, they need to be able to go and do that. And I tell people like, probably of all of those interviews I do, and I mean, it's dozens, if not over 100 a year, 90% of the candidates will not pass my interview. And I'm not like a crazy interviewer. I think these are reasonable questions and expectations, for someone who's coming into the job. And so I just think, people, that the opportunity is right for folks to focus on leveling up there. I interviewed someone yesterday, a senior candidate who literally didn't mention one number in a 40-minute interview.
If our listeners can only remember one thing from our conversation today, what is that one thing?
The importance of alignment. I think aligned teams are successful teams. And as I said earlier, I think the number one way to do it is to align compensation. But I think far and away, that is what separates good from great and amazing teams.
This is where I think communication matters and why it's not part of the top team, but its own skill is alignment is communication, because communication is talking and listening, like you said in the beginning, because you're a good sales leader.
Communication is the means to the end, right? Exactly to your point. That's how do you drive alignment? You need clarity and you need communication and you need to reinforce that clarity over and over and over again.
But I think also the listening cultivates the alignment, because you need to listen to what people are actually saying to understand whether or not they're aligned.
Completely agreed. And I do think that's where practices like the quarterly business reviews are huge. And in a prior organization, I heard an executive complaining to the CEO that he had to sit in all of the different functional QBRs. And going back to our point around what makes a great executive, I'm like, that is the most naive comment I have ever heard. Because for you to be a great executive and for you to know how this business operates, you need to know what's going on here. And to our earlier conversation, you have to be willing to challenge, right? If it doesn't make sense, ask the question. Because when you don't challenge is when you end up in the blame game 90 days later, right? That no one ever questioned. How are we going to, 5X our pipeline over 90 days or whatever it may be?
You're like, do you read the news? Come on, man. What's going on? So on that note, thank you, Cassie, for joining us on the Operations Room. If you like what you hear, please leave us a comment or subscribe, and we will see you next week.